So my name's Rodger Citron, and I'm a professor at Toro Law Center. This is a Toro Law Review podcast, and we're delighted today that our guest is David Guterson. I hope I pronounced that correctly. And David is an accomplished author. He writes novels, and we're going to discuss a novel he completed, I believe, that was published in 2022. It's called The Final Case. And so the first thing I want to say is thank you, David, for joining us. And the first question is, please just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me. And I am eager to have a good conversation today about The Final Case. But let me tell you about myself first. I was born in Seattle, grew up in the north end of Seattle, went to Seattle public schools, and upon graduation from high school, enrolled at the University of Washington, which is also in my neighborhood. And after 4 years there, studying English literature, I went on, got a master's degree in creative writing, and then a teaching certificate. And then I had a 10-year career as a public school English teacher from about 84 to 94. In 94, Snow Falling on Cedars, my first novel, came out. And since then, I've made my living as a writer. I still live in the Seattle area, and I have lived here my entire life.
Thank you. And the I can't help but make the joke of I hope you bought your home before Microsoft took off. Knowing Seattle, you don't have to answer that one. So The Final Case, you tell us right at the start, at the beginning, that it's a work of fiction. And so one of the reasons why I wanted to, have you on the Law Review podcast is because I teach the law and literature course. And so I find, the representation of law and literature very interesting. And yet you also say on that same introductory, in that beginning, that there in fact was such a case in Washington State, and that you researched and I don't know if you actually reported on the case, that is, wrote about it, but that you conducted a fair amount of research as part of the process for writing the novel. If we go back to the early 2010s, what drew you to the case, and how did you begin to think of it as something you could write about?
Mm-hmm. Let me first address your initial point about the author's note, in which I make a prefacing statement prior to the novel's beginning. That author's note, and this is ironic in a way, was a function of legal advice that I got. In other words, the attorney for the publishing house, thought it was important that we have a note like this at the beginning, make clear this is a work of fiction. And I was fine with that, although it created a sense of contradiction around the opening line of the novel, which is, a while back I stopped writing fiction. What that does for the reader is just leave sort of a question mark about the tension between that author's note and the first line of the novel, which is, it's fine with me if reality is sort of up for grabs in a novel. And when I say an initial line, a while back I stopped writing fiction, that's just the author's attempt to create the illusion of reality, which is important to draw the reader in, that they actually believe. And I didn't have any sort of metafictional notions in mind with that. I'm not particularly interested in the tension between reality and fiction, or fiction commenting on fiction. That there's none of that going on in this book. But yeah, this book is based very much on a trial that actually unfolded here in Washington State, north of Seattle, in rural county, Skagit County. It was June, I believe, May of 2011, in the news, the word got out that a girl adopted by a fundamentalist and very sort of right-wing family there. They had adopted a girl from Ethiopia. That girl had been found dead of hypothermia just outside the door of the house. A couple of months later, her adoptive parents were arrested on charges of homicide by abuse. And then in the summer of 2013, the trial began. And I attended every day. I mean, went to pre-trial hearings. I went to the jury selection, and it was the longest trial in the history of Skagit County. It was 7 or 8 weeks. I went every day, and then I returned for the sentencing. And along the way, I did a considerable amount of research about the legal aspects of the legal process that were unfolding that I didn't understand. I started looking up, for example, legal precedents. I started wondering about some issues that were potentially in play on a potential appeal. I wondered sort of what the crux issues were in terms of an appeal. I just became grounded in the legal aspects of this trial and learned as I went. But to get really, I guess, to more directly answering your question here, my wife and I are the adoptive parents of a girl from Ethiopia. And she actually was available, as they say, on the adoption market at the same time as this young girl who died of hypothermia in her yard. And so the adoption agency was local. My daughter and this girl were sort of had come out of the same moment and out of the same processes. I was part of a larger community of adoptive parents. I was part of a community of adoptive parents who participate in the larger Ethiopian diaspora community in Seattle, which is a significant size. Well, all of these things, drew me to the case, and then my interest in the case drew me into writing the novel.
Um, there's a lot there, and the can you say a little bit about one of the things that we talk about in law and literature, and I really want to be respectful of, is sort of where we started about it's a work of fiction. That is, you're telling a story, a fictional story, and there's all these things that you did to write the story in terms of whether it was research, imagination, editing, all those types of things. As you were observing the case, observing the trial and the hearings and so on, were you at that time also trying to construct the story, or was it rather, or something else, in the sense of, was it, I want to bear witness to what has occurred to understand this because of what's going on in my life, and then later on you began to sort of think through what kind of story this could be as a novel?
Well, so I first became aware of this incident in May of 2011, and I was immediately, when the story came out, the story broke in the media that this girl had died, the circumstances were suspicious. Immediately, I became emotionally involved in that and started seeing about myself that I was focused on it, that I started to feel that something would come of this for me as a writer. I mean, not only was I feeling a personal interest in the whole matter, given my circumstances as an adoptive parent and as part of this larger community, but at some other level, I was disturbed enough by these events to feel like exploring them in writing, to try to understand what happened and why it happened. was something I wanted to take on, not just at a personal level, but at a professional level. So I entered the process in the summer of 2011 of tracking everything that was going on, paying close attention to this thing as it unfolded. And then when the trial began in the summer, 2 years later, I had at that point I hadn't written anything, and I had no idea what I would write. But by the time that trial was over in August, I knew that I was going to write something, but I didn't know enough about the matter to do it yet. So the next step was to go to Ethiopia and find this girl's family, which I did. And after that, I would say by the following winter, I began to construct a novel in my head around what I had learned and experienced over the last 2 or 3 years of thinking about this and feeling drawn to it.
Um, the so I want to. It's interesting to hear from someone, well past the age, for example, of many of the students at the law school, the way in which you really immersed yourself in the legal system. And so I just want to sort of stay with that for a moment. Did you know? Do you have what is your sense of the legal system? And I want to say that sort of like in two ways. That is, one is it, it's common. We always say, well, trials are about storytelling. That is, there's a narrative dimension to the legal system. And of course, as a professional writer, I'm curious as to, how you thought about that. But then, of course, there's the justice function of the legal system. And I'm curious to see that, once you really sort of begin to investigate or to explore the legal system, what you thought of it as you were, immersed in it.
Yeah, a couple of points here. So the final case is my sixth novel, and it's the second one that I've set in a legal context and in a courtroom environment, largely in a courtroom environment, because a trial presents a natural narrative with a beginning, a middle, and an end, and a natural sense of conflict. Is this person really guilty? What exactly happened? How's it going to turn out? What's the verdict going to be? I mean, those things are just natural elements of a story existing in the real world. And that's why the whole genre of the courtroom drama exists, because it has those elements that lend itself to what fiction writers do. And so number one, it has that sort of natural value to anybody trying to tell a story. It gives you a frame or gives you a natural structure for storytelling, which you can take advantage of. And but let me kind of go back a bit so that I can put in context my interest in this whole matter. So my father was a criminal attorney. He was born in Seattle like me. He At that time you could fast track your way through law school. They had a sort of a pre-law major that happened in about 3 years, something like that, and then the whole thing took maybe 5 or 6 years instead of now. I guess it's 7. 4 years undergraduate and 3 law school years now. But my point is, my father, by the time he was 22 or 23, he was working in the legal world, and he started out as a prosecutor. He did that for about a year.
Can I interrupt only to ask? I'm sorry. Just can you? It would be really just dates. In other words, when did he? So when did
Yeah.
become what year did he become a lawyer? Because yes,
Yep.
you actually
Sure.
his
My
story
father,
is about legal
yeah,
education. Yeah, sorry. Or that.
he was born in December of 1929, and he started his legal work in the early 50s. He was in law school probably, 49, 50, 51, 52, in college and law school. And by 53, I would guess he was underway as a prosecutor. And he worked as a King County deputy prosecutor, and he worked as a U.S. attorney. And I think his whole career on that side was about 2 years. And then he hung out his shingle solo as a defense attorney. But he ended up teaming up with some other attorneys. And from his point of view, it was all about just streamlining and expediting his criminal law practice, because the other people he joined with in his firm, none of them were on the criminal side. But they were friends of his that he had met at law school, people he knew. And, you know, we can share office expenses, we can share the secretarial pool. And my father didn't share in the firm's profits, but he was a partner in the sense that he participated in all the expenses of the office. Now, he was with illustrious people. One of them, Gordon Culp, wrote the state bills for Hawaii and Alaska. And the other, Bill Dwyer, was the federal judge and eventually a federal judge who made the Spotted Owl decision about old growth forests. Bill and Gordy were his partners. So my father was with some really great people, but he stuck with criminal law. He did only criminal law until he died. Really, he worked up into about a year before his death. He had a very long career. And being his child, I imbibed a lot of his, I'm not quite sure what language to give it. I mean, but he had a very noble sense of the law. I mean, jurisprudence and the sort of the idea of justice being a philosophical notion. Questions like, is justice sort of just something human beings have made up? Is it a right that human beings have? Is it not? You know, what is justice? Those questions were important to him, and they became important to me. And I grew up with, you know, my father, he admired Clarence Darrow. I ended up, you know, reading at a young age Darrow's autobiography, and my father would talk about the Scopes monkey trial. My father loved, for example, 12 Angry Men, the film, A Man for All Seasons. And so just this sense of being, you know, you're innocent until you're proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. I just got on board with that from an early age, at the sort of the noble view of how really beautiful the whole concept is, that we have such a thing that we call justice and that we seek it. We put a lot into it. We put a lot of money, we put a lot of resources, we put a lot of brain power into getting it right, you know. And growing up in my father's home, I sort of digested that noble view of the law. Now, when I started really getting immersed in this case, the one behind my novel, I began to see more inside the realities and the practicalities of the law. And I grew to have a more balanced view. Yes, there's a nobility to the law. And yes, this pursuit of justice is a wonderful thing. But the actual mechanics of it were not as noble as I had thought growing up in my father's home. And my sense of that started during jury selection. And it started, for me personally, the times that I've been called to jury duty and sort of watched what the attorneys are doing. And I say to myself, you know, if everybody in this room really was about finding somebody who can be impartial and objective, and that's all they really cared about, you know, they want the law to work, they want 12 people who can be impartial and objective, they wouldn't be asking these questions, they'd be asking other questions. They're not really looking for that. They're looking for jurors that they can win with. And right away, I felt it's not what I grew up with, you know. I thought I was going to meet these noble attorneys who believed in finding 12 impartial people, but I didn't. And that's just one example of how I came to have a more, I guess, balanced and realistic view of the law than the one I grew up with.
This is such a rich point because, I don't teach criminal law or procedure, but I do teach civil procedure, and jury selection is certainly something we talk about, in the second semester of the course. And it can sometimes open the door to, so why do we have an adversarial system? Because, right, the competition, the fact that we say, do your best to win, um, can have
Well, I get that.
compromising or even
On the one
corrosive.
hand, your
Yes.
duty, your obligation as a professional representing a client is to win, to do everything that's legal within the law to win. On the other hand, you have this obligation to this sense of fairness and impartiality. So how do you navigate? How do you balance those concerns going forward? Well, the attorneys that I came across in this case weren't balancing them. They only wanted to win. And you can't blame them for that. And as you say, it's inherent in the nature of an adversarial system that you're going to have that. It's part of no legal system is perfect. Ultimately, my father said this over and over again. No matter how you construct it, it comes down to human beings. It comes down to the fairness, the decency, and the wisdom of the human participants in the case, whether it be the judge, the attorneys, the jurors, everybody involved. No matter how you construct the system, what kind of constraints you put in place, or limitations, or regulations, or laws, or stipulations, in the end, it's about people. And I saw that clearly in the summer of 2013 at this trial.
I want to do sort of two questions regarding your father. One, the person of your father, that is, him as an attorney. Probably one of my favorite professors in law school. Not only did he teach criminal law, but he basically ran a criminal defense practice out of his office. It's a very interesting story that he got 10 years as a tax professor and then decided, he was a former William O. Douglas clerk, and thought it's too important not to be doing criminal defense from what he had seen and so on. But he said, and this is by the time I was his student, he'd been teaching and practicing for decades. And he said, it's hard not to become cynical. It's, to live in the adversarial system. And he was also speaking as a criminal defense attorney that, with the passing of the Warren Court and the current Supreme Court, and the idea of, quote, harmless error, well, they violated your rights, but you're still guilty, so the conviction will be affirmed. He said, really, it's if this is something that you're thinking about, you're going to have to wrestle with that. And so the question is, your father, was he able to resist, the cynicism, the nihilism, that I think is really part and parcel of being a criminal defense attorney, or can be?
Well, you see attorneys who develop all manner of strategies, including self-presentation, persona, who they appear to be to the jurors, really to the entire courtroom, the judge. Look, we all have a number of personas that we can enact. We can be different people at different times. It's not phony. It's you modulate your self-presentation according to circumstances. Now, my father's manner in court was to always be plain spoken and very cordial and full of grace and polite, never adversarial, never directly adversarial in a mean-spirited way, never cynical about anything, always showing belief in the system, that it exists to do the right thing, never showing anger or impatience. No, he was really good at modulating his personality so that what he put out into the world was a sense of somebody who had no cynicism. And knowing him personally, I'm sure being a human being, we all have cynicism. I mean, there's no escaping some cynicism. I think my father, like anybody, had some measure of it, less than most people, but he had some measure of it. I also know about my father that he really wanted the right thing to happen, you know, that no, no matter, even though his job was to get the best outcome he could for his client, he knew the whole time that really there was a appropriate response that the society should have to whatever had been done. And even though he was asking for something less severe than that appropriate response, in the back of his mind or in the front of his mind, he wanted the system to work. He wanted that appropriate, he would do his utmost for the client. But ultimately, when he walked out at the end, he would say to himself, I lost, but what happened was the right thing. He could be that way. Yeah.
Yeah, no, very sincerely, because in these discussions, I've talked several times to defense attorneys. It's a very, very, I say this with 100% sincerity, it's a very healthy attitude to have. And so that's interesting. The second question I wanted to ask, of course, is now when we go into the world of the novel, we have our fictional narrator, and he's assisting his father, his elderly father, with this case, this final case, as it turns out to be. And I want to sort of ask the question as broadly as possible because, in what ways do we see your father in the character of Royal, the attorney for one of the defendants in the case?
In many ways, I mean, there's a clear one-to-one correspondence between my father and this a lawyer in the book named Royal. Uh, and what happened was that summer of 2013, when this trial unfolded, was my father's last summer. He had retired about 2 years before, knowing that he had lost some mental faculties. And during those 2 years, he went into a fairly rapid decline into dementia or Alzheimer's. And during that summer of 2013, when I was an hour and a half north of Seattle all the time in Skagit County at this trial, my father was going downhill rapidly, which meant at the end of the day, when court ended, if I wanted to, I could drive down to Seattle and spend time with him, which I did. And then that fall, he died. So I guess you would say psychologically and emotionally, these two things got tied together for me. This was the summer of this trial, but it was also the summer of my father's end. And creatively, imaginatively, those two things came together in the novel. I mean, you and I have talked a little bit already about the book, that it's not your conventional sort of procedural novel where it builds towards this climax in which there's a guilty or not guilty sort of ending. In a sort of surprise, I think, for readers, the book makes a turn, makes a shift about 2/3 of the way through. It's not that the trial goes away or interest in the trial goes away, but what takes center stage at that point is the relationship between the narrator and his father and the larger family in which his demise is unfolding. And that family portrait, that portrait of the family, stands in juxtaposition to the family in Skagit County that had adopted this girl and then abused her to death. You've got these two families standing in juxtaposition to one another in the novel, and that was part of my intent. I didn't really want to write a procedural. I didn't really think it was interesting, the question of were they guilty or not guilty. I mean, what was more interesting was, why did this happen, and why is was this one family this way, this other family this other way? There's more investigation into human beings than it is a legal procedural.
Yes, yes. And I know that I don't want to sort of go there yet to the final third of the novel, only because right, this is as a law professor, as someone who teaches law and literature course, I'm a little bit obtuse about staying with the law here, and I just want to do that for one or two questions more. Um,
Well,
David,
I'm happy to stay with the law. I really am.
okay,
Yeah.
yeah, no, I appreciate that. I kind of feel like certainly conceivable that someone listening might say he's
I mean,
telling you to move on. He's telling you to move on, but not yet. The
I do have
Go
something
ahead.
to tell you about the law here. I'll just throw it out.
Sure.
So this was a homicide by abuse trial. And homicide by abuse went on the books as a statute in Washington State in the 1980s. After this case of abuse and mortality involving a 3 or 4 year old child named Eli Creekmore. And when Eli Creekmore's image began to show up in the newspaper and on the news, and he had been brutally mistreated and died at the hands of these parents, this was the moment that precipitated a sort of political uproar. We had no law on the books for something like this. Well, because it was a politically charged issue, the Washington State Senate took up this matter and created this law, homicide by abuse. Created a number of other laws too that sort of were generated by the Eli Creekmore incident. But in their hurry, they weren't particularly careful about some details, right? Because one of the assumptions people have about homicide by abuse, naturally, is that this is something that happens to toddlers and infants, and in fact, in the 200 or so homicide by abuse trials in Washington State since the law went on the books, all of them are, in fact, the vast majority of the kids are under 5 years old. Some of them are up to about 10 years old. Well, this case, the age of the deceased became a question because they had made the age cutoff something like in the law, they just threw out some number like 13 or 14 that they figured it wouldn't matter. But it turned out to matter in this case, and a lot pivoted on it. I mean, they disinterred her remains to look at her teeth, and her bones, and to try to determine her age. They brought in experts to discuss her age. She had no birth certificate because of being where she was born. You could enter a birth certificate as evidence, as you normally would, in just sort of a perfunctory way. They brought her close relative from Ethiopia to testify as to her age. All of these things came into play because this law just sort of, I went back in the congressional record and sort of, they just yayed and nayed their way through it in no time. I even called the guy who brought the bill, and he said, yeah, I do remember that we were, doing 3 or 4 bills all out at Eli Creekmore, and, the language wasn't careful. The language wasn't careful in more ways than one. And it really reinforced for me something I already knew, which is the language of the statute is everything. It is not whether they're good people or bad people, nice people, evil people. No, the only question is, did they do exactly what this statute calls for? And the language of the statute is all important, and paves the way for everything that happens, So the statute is ambiguous in some way, or leaves a huge amount of room for interpretation. And there are all these other cases that get brought, and all this precedent, all this arguing about the meaning of terminology, that if they had just been more careful at the beginning, could have resolved some of that. One of the terms in the statute is the word torture. And the precedent in Washington State says that torture is defined in the common usage, that we all know what torture means. Look it up in the dictionary, But the prosecution took the chance of bringing in 2 expert witnesses on the meaning of torture who, they flew in at great expense. And this became critical on appeal, right? Because you've exposed the jury now to all of this information about torture, and you've influenced how they view torture, when in fact you never should have done that, because the definition of torture is already been laid down by precedent. Uh, so there were some, I guess my point is, look, along the way, there were some, to me, really interesting legal issues unfolding that even if I forget about being a writer, just being a person, being interested in what's going on, I found a lot to be interested in.
Yeah, the and I was thinking too, like last night I was sort of quickly rereading, and I know some of this is presented in the opening statement of Royal, um, because he has a very, you know, specific response about the specific
Yeah,
charge. Um, uh, I'm well, I feel like I want to go back to the actual case. That is the actual
sure.
case. And my I'll just ask, there was an appeal, and was the conviction affirmed on appeal?
Yeah, in fact, it ultimately went all the way to the state Supreme Court and was affirmed at every level. And they're both serving long sentences. I think they each got something like 37 years.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Um, and then the I'll sort of pivot to the literary piece because as we corresponded before talking today, uh, you know I don't know whether this was something that you intended or even thought about, but I went To Kill a Mockingbird and Atticus and Atticus's children, and it's imperfect to say the least. I just wonder whether, you know, what literary texts, novels about the law or even more broadly may have influenced you along the way as you were sort of thinking through the story that you wanted to tell.
Mhm. Well, uh, To Kill a Mockingbird is a good touchstone. I would say, with regard to my prior legal novel, Snow Falling on Cedars, that the question about To Kill a Mockingbird came up often, and rightly so. I was a high school English teacher, and I taught that book sometimes more than once a year. Probably read it 20 times, and discussed it with students 20 times, and knew it inside and out. And I I did like the way in which that book did at least two things simultaneously. It depicted a family and a relationship, Scout and Atticus and their family, Jim, this world of a family with its own sadness and its own love, and then the world of this trial. These two tracks are proceeding simultaneously and resonating with one another as a structure for storytelling is clearly there in the final case. So structurally, in some regards, this book does, borrow from To Kill a Mockingbird. I would say in that way, particularly, it is similar. Also, um, the narration, the first person narration from the point of view of the child of the attorney.
Mhm.
Um, you know, there's a beautiful voiceover in the film, Scout's voice speaking to you in the film. And that right away creates a certain kind of emotional context in which the story unfolds. The feelings that a child might have for a parent um, are available when you have that sort of first person narrator. So you can see the choices that writers make, storytellers make. Who's the right person to tell this story? What's the right point of view for this story? And what's the right way to structure it? And how do those two things work together? And those are just two pieces. There are a lot of other pieces to bring into the mix and get them to organically fit the structure, the voice, the point of view, the landscape, um, and so on and so forth. The characters, everything's got to work together.
Um, yeah, the were there were there, any other novels that substantially, you know, influenced what you were doing in this novel? Um, I mean,
No, there
yeah.
are no, really, I wouldn't say that any other novel really influenced this novel.
Mhm.
And I would say in general, as far as sort of literary influences go, there are writers I really, really admire. And I think of them as, just incredibly good at what they do. And I have to tell myself, yeah, but that's not me. I have to try to do what I'm good at, whatever that is, and try to find it. So I try to push aside influences and talk to myself about, what is it that I can do? Um, so for me, I have a funny relationship to literary influences, I guess.
Yeah, in fact, I think the way you rephrased it, maybe that would have been a more helpful question because I'm just, thinking about, I know that, for example, I had the pleasure and the privilege of meeting Edward P. Jones after he wrote The Known World. And he said that he started researching, the story of the idea of African Americans owning slaves, that it was a germ of something. And then he started to research it and he said, you know what, I have to stop because I want to tell my story. And
Yeah,
I don't, want those sort of influences
yeah,
seeping in directly or indirectly. Um, but let me as they say, let me rephrase. And I'm just curious to who are some of the authors, that you admire for
yeah.
for their talent, their ability, and then for what they write.
Before answering that, you mentioned Edward P. Jones and his research, and then getting to this point where it's time to stop the research because you have too many influences. That happens to me. It's not that I feel I have too many influences, but sort of the way I'm put together, sort of mentally, is to constantly go down rabbit holes. So if I do research, I mean, I can get so far away that after a couple of hours, I wake up and where am I? I mean, this was fascinating, and I really, really enjoyed following this down this rabbit hole. But 99% of it has got nothing to do with the novel. It becomes an end in its own right, and I love doing it. So at a certain point, I have to cut myself off for that reason. Now, as far as writers who I enormously admire, among living writers, Ishiguro was a Nobel Prize winner. Um, a Spanish writer named Javier Marias, who is incredibly talented, smart guy. Another Nobel Prize winner who's South African but now living in Australia is J.M. Coetzee. And then I really admired W.G. Sebald, a modern writer, but he did unfortunately passed away in an auto accident maybe 20 years ago. Among contemporary writers, those ones have really spoken to me. But sort of going back, I the greats are the greats to me. Don Quixote, um, Paradise Lost, The Divine Comedy, Shakespeare. Yeah, I'm a Western classicist. I mean, I engaged those things as a college student. They got under my skin, and they're still there. I really, um, carry those with me and cherish those sort of canonical Western texts.
Um, yeah, and the only comment I'll make because I don't want to we don't have all day, but really, Ishiguro, um, the remains of the day is often taught in law and literature courses, right? The cost, if you will, of service or the idea of the agent to the principal and the cost of that. And of course, it's so beautifully written, and
Mhm.
the question of the narrator and the reliability of the narrator is done so well. Um, turning back to the final case, this is you know, you let the cat out of the bag in the sense of saying, there's in the last third, the novel turns in a way that if you're thinking, oh, this is a procedural about a case, in fact, the novel goes in a different direction in that final third, and I won't say more, but I guess I have two questions, um, uh, and one is, um, did you know more or less from the start or not that you were going to go in that direction as you were headed to the finish line?
Well, so first, let me say this. It's sort of widely taken as a truth that the thing that readers are interested in is what they turn the page to find out what's going to happen next. And that's what they're really interested in. To some extent, yes. And I also know there's readers who absolutely love the page they're on right now and are reading for the page they're on. Like the beauty of the prose, the complexity of the situation, the characterization, the page itself is for me the driving force. Like what's going to happen? Actually, for me as a reader, to tell you the truth, I don't turn the page to find out what's going to happen next. I turn the page to experience the incredible tour de force performance that's happening on that page. It's like listening to music. You're listening to the music in the moment. So I keep that in mind when I'm writing. I try to balance the concern for the reader's need to wonder what's going to happen next with the reader's attentiveness to the page itself, and the page itself being a reason to read. And that's really, really important to me. I guess I would describe myself as, I don't know if I'd say I'm a stylist, but prose matters to me a lot. I'm not trying to get, to the end. I'm trying to make this sentence as good as it can be over and over and over again until the novel's finished, And for me as a reader, part of the great pleasure is the experience of reading beautiful sentences of great and of experiencing the great complexity of being human along the way. So now, in the course of giving that very long answer, I forgot what your other part of the question was.
Oh, and this was uh it was a plot centered question in the sense of uh as you were
Oh, did I know where I was headed?
like was
Yeah.
this did you end where you thought you would,
No,
or where you planned to?
I have never written a novel where I know where I'm going. I have never done that. I'm not capable of that. If I had sort of an outline ahead of time that A, B, C, D, E, F were going to happen, and there's a structure that already exists, and I'm sort of filling in the blanks, I wouldn't be able to write. I'd get bored. For me, it's all about finding out what's going to happen next and dealing with the problem that's in front of me as a writer right now. Like what would this person really do? Where would this really go? And the old saying, character is fate. You learn more about your character with every decision the character makes. And that's what drives the story forward. And you find out what's going to happen. I mean, I could be halfway through a novel and think I know at this point, okay, now I get it. This is where it's going. It doesn't go there at all. It really comes together in a very strange, inexplicable way with no real advanced sense of coherence, which for me is part of the fun and beauty of doing it.
Mm-hmm. Um, the and then the second question about the last third or so of the book, you touched on earlier, which I really comes through. In other words, it really this juxtaposition of these two families, and do you think in the end, and it's I almost don't know whether I'm asking about what happened in the real case or in your novel. I mean, it is the kind of horror that you learned about and then that you wrote about. is it explainable or understandable, or is it just this is part of God, I hate to say it, but
Yeah.
it's because it sounds cliche, but right, it's part of the human condition that there's this capacity for evil or wrong, and sometimes it erupts or flashes, and we can do the best we can to make sense of it. But anyway, there's a question
No,
here.
it's a good question, and I am realistic, and I do believe there's such a thing as a psychopath or a sociopath, and that their conduct and actions do constitute inexplicable evil. Um, was that the case here? Now, my tendency is to investigate as far as I can, and learn as much as I can about the accused. And rather than assuming, oh, you're a sociopath, you're a psychopath, that's all I need to know. Um, may not be the case. They may not be a sociopath or a psychopath. They might be themselves psychologically and emotionally distorted by their circumstances, and that's at least part of the picture. They might have been naive, they might have been confused, they might have been under the influence of others, a whole construct of forces that are at play in somebody's life that can end in a kind of tragedy. Is somebody responsible for that tragedy? Yes, somebody ultimately is responsible for it. But I came away from this trial with a lot of empathy for the two who were ultimately convicted and serving those 37 years. I got to know their circumstances and their lives really, really well. And I didn't come away feeling, well, that they don't deserve it and they shouldn't, but I felt badly about it. I really did. I saw them as very human, very frail and human, and rather than as evil.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Um, the we've I think I can't quite tell the clock, but I want to I want to ask, do you feel like whether in the realm of law or literature, at least as it relates to the novel, this is kind of the catch-all question, is there anything we've, you know, missed that we should that you'd like to touch on now? I do want to sort of give you the chance to.
Yeah. I mean, I to taking into account, what we're doing, I assume that the people who are going to be taking a look at this will primarily be law students or people interested in the law. And where does an interest in the law and an interest in storytelling intersect? Well, as you said earlier in our conversation, a lot of the law is about storytelling, particularly in a criminal uh, trial. I mean, the complete opposite storylines that are being put forth, which we see in media every day. When the attorney, for the defendant says one thing about what's going on, the prosecutor says the total opposite. It's like, I mean, point of view, who owns the story, who tells the story. There is no such thing as a story. There's no such thing as what happened. There is only the interpretation of what happened. It's very, very difficult to establish anything as objective. It's very, very difficult to know what happened. And that's where a storyteller and somebody who works in the legal arena intersect. We're both asking ourselves those kinds of questions.
Um, Very much, very much. And it's one of the reasons why, um, while law and literature, it doesn't have the same sort of centrality or primacy as, for example, law and economics. Um, it's still, you know, it still is something to be reckoned with. And
Oh,
so
absolutely.
it is,
As a
that's
high
why it's.
school English teacher, I can tell you that I believe in the power of literature in every regard in a human life. That this is one place where we learn a lot about what it means to be human, whether it's professional or personal or in any other regard. That's the power of literature. It has profound things to say about our lives, and it's very much worth the time. At least I tried to make the case for that as a teacher.
Uh, um, really, I think that's in the parlance of the law as good a closing statement as we're going to get. Um,
Okay,
I thank you so much for the time and the very, very interesting conversation.
thank
And
you.
thank you.